Blomcast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Hello and welcome to the Blomcast, the podcast that looks at changing points in history. Today I want to choose one particular changing point, a changing point that is engulfing us all, a changing point that is describing our lives. And this changing point sits in a wider context, a context that is described today by many people who are trying to analyze the present as a polycrisis. This is a term that has been popularized particularly by historian colleague Adam Tooze, and Adam has made a very strong case for this multiple crisis. Really a series of interlocking crises that can't be understood and certainly also not resolved individually. Crises like the pandemic that we had, like runaway inflation, like war in Ukraine and the Israel-Gaza war, like the crisis of an international order that is threatened by these wars, but also of the food insecurity that comes with it. And of course, with the great crisis underlying these all, the climate crisis, the crisis of the collapse of biodiversity, all these things mutually reinforce and influence one another and really can't be thought of in isolation. And one of this cluster of crises is one that I think we all notice, particularly in our thinking lives, in our political lives, in our social lives, and that is what I think of as the collapse, or perhaps the threatening collapse, of the liberal project. And let's just define terms here. When I speak of a liberal project, I don't mean liberal politics as such, liberal parties that are somewhere in the center of the political landscape between the left-wing and the right-wing parties. I certainly also don't mean a neoliberal idea of the world and of its economy, but I mean liberalism in a much wider sense, in a sense that goes back perhaps to John Locke, to Alexis de Tocqueville, and especially in the 20th century to Isaiah Berlin, a Russian Jewish philosopher who spent most of his life and work in England, and whom I was fortunate to meet and have discussions with as a very young man when I was studying there. And Isaiah Berlin frames the liberal project really as a child of the Enlightenment, of the emancipatory drive that drove Enlightenment thinkers, Enlightenment politics, a drive towards freedom, towards autonomy, but also towards a rule-based world that would be the basis of this freedom, or freedom of expression, religion, sexuality, etc. But really a political tradition that has emancipation and a striving for freedom in its heart. This tradition has been very important for the last 2 centuries, really, and it has become overwhelmingly important in the 20th century. And I want to just perhaps create a little bit of historical context before we go on to the collapse of the liberal project. Let me sketch in, perhaps for contrast, if we speak about the collapse of liberalism today, of a liberal ideal, not so much as liberal politics, then let me sketch in for contrast that only a generation ago we had something that you might describe as the sort of apogee, the climax of the liberal tradition, the great triumph of the liberal tradition. And that was the collapse of the Soviet Union, the tearing down of the Iron Curtain, the end of Soviet socialism. Because until then, so until 1989 and following, until then there was a great ideological battle, the Cold War. The Cold War that was also an economic battle, a military conflict, but mostly also an ideological conflict. And it seemed very clear that socialism had lost, that Soviet socialism had collapsed under its own weight, had not been able to fulfill its promises, and that only the liberal world offered answers to the world's problems. Only the liberal creed should and did survive. And yes, the most famous, not to say notorious, articulation of that was the essay by the then young political scientist Francis Fukuyama, who has spent a very distinguished career living down and commenting on this early essay that he wrote with the very short title, "The End of History?" ? In the essay, it was still a question. In the book that appeared 3 years later, it was already a received truth, the end of history and the last man. But the essay was still more questioning. And in this essay, he made it clear that the triumph of Western liberalism was total. He wrote, "What we are witnessing is perhaps not just the end of the Cold War or the end of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such, i.e. the end point of the ideological evolution of humanity and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government." It's an amazing statement to make, that at some point history has simply ended. We've come to the end point, we've found the best of all worlds, and here it is. Now, first of all, this is selling Fukuyama somewhat short, because his thesis was more differentiated than that, and he didn't see the end of history actually as something fantastic and triumphant. He looked at it almost nostalgically and sadly as a time when simply, let's say, the historical dialectic had disappeared. And now there would be only events. Now there would only be events between markets. There would no longer be changes in government, changes in power. So that would be the end of history. But it is pretty amazing to see and to look back at this time and to read documents, watch interviews from this time and see the total certainty among many in the West, throughout the political spectrum, that this really was the triumph, and from now on the world would be drawn magically into the gravitational field of liberal markets and liberal democracies, and these markets and democracies would work hand in hand, and you couldn't have one without the other. So if you liberalized the markets, then necessarily the political landscape of a country would become democratic and would transform the society in a positive way into a society of striving people being part of the economy, I suppose. Well, the amazing thing is that it didn't come like that, that this didn't happen. This was not the end of history. But before we take this plunge into what happened instead, let's just remember what an amazing ride this was. From the beginning of the 20th century, when Europe was poor, already powerful, but still most people lived in great poverty, through 2 cataclysmic world wars, then to a time after 1945 of unparalleled growth and prosperity, something that simply had never been there before. Growth not only economically, but also culturally, in terms of the access people had to education, in healthcare, in the whole social system. Electrification arrived in many places only after the Second World War, also in Europe. So a huge change in the lives of people, and a hugely positive change in the lives of people, and with that, of course, also a moral revolution. The 68 rebellion, student rebellion, that liberalized the moral world very strongly, at least in Western Europe. The arrival of the pill, which was hugely important for the sexual revolution. So many key technologies. And then, of course, the digitization of the world, the automation of the economy began. So huge vectors of change and huge growth in wealth, in power, in ease, and in peace. It was a peaceful time in Europe. Now, when I describe this so idyllically, this is, of course, a very foreshortened perspective on this historical period that looked quite differently outside of the Western countries, the rich Western countries that participated in this enormous growth. That was a time of conflict, of post-colonial conflicts, of decolonization, perhaps even of economic recolonization. That was a time of exploitation. I mean, it's very important to remember, I grew up in Germany in the post-war era. And I grew up in a liberal family, so of course there was always the shadow of the Second World War and what had happened not so long before. But there was also a very strong sense of, now we've learned our lessons, we are proper democrats, we are part of a liberal world. And because we are that, we live in peace, we are wealthy, we live with stability. It was essentially a question of virtues. We had the better principles, the better virtues. Therefore, we were doing better in the world than the rest of the world. And yes, this narrative, of course, completely marginalizes the fact that the West had got rich on the back of slavery, of colonization, of imperialism, of suppression also of its own poor, which is often forgotten. So that the Western wealth, even after the Second World War, was certainly not a question simply of having superior values. And for instance, the peace in the Western world, the peace in Europe, well, I think the Western world simply fought its wars conveniently far away. It fought its wars in Afghanistan, in Vietnam, in the Congo, in South American countries. This was where the violence went on, where the empires locked horns. It wasn't in a direct confrontation. And similar things, by the way, happened for the industrial base, because with the deindustrialization of Western countries, that also meant that it became a lot easier to have a clean economy and simply receive the consumer goods that had been produced elsewhere, leaving the pollution also elsewhere, leaving the environmental destruction, and often the social destruction also elsewhere. So when I speak about this amazing blossoming of a liberal world in the so-called global West, I do not want to forget what this so-called global West owes to the rest of the world, and that it was also a result of practices that would be today regarded abhorrent and were already regarded as abhorrent by people at the time. But also it has to be said that these oppressive structures that became a global reality were not the only thing. There were also forces within these liberal societies that worked for a continuation of this liberal project, of the Enlightenment project, because it wasn't these oppressive strategies, these oppressive realities that motivated the civil rights movement in the US, or the feminist movement, or the Stonewall and the gay pride movement. So there were a lot of initiatives also from within societies to transform these societies, not only in an economic way, but also in a social and even a moral way. And this transformation was successful and wasn't just an oppressive project, but liberated the many people. And also it had its effects across the world, for instance, in an International Court of Human Rights, in a Declaration of Human Rights, which is not respected, which is not a political reality, but which is at least a political ambition and something to appeal to, and at least sets a standard that hadn't been there before. So the liberal project, for all its dark sides, had a real dynamism. And, 30 years after its seeming total historical triumph, we stand almost in front of its ruins today. The liberal international order is challenged by emergent powers that are anti-liberal or not liberal. The liberal assumption that free markets and free societies go together has been disproven, for instance, by countries like China. The liberal global order has not liberated people, but has created new forms of dependency and exploitation and slavery, and has in many ways continued power structures that were already there before. The liberalization of the economy has in many ways transferred democratic powers to undemocratic actors, to actors that are not elected and that take important decisions about the lives of people. And within our own societies, the liberal project seems to be sufficiently eroded to give rise to xenophobic, racist populists who seem to be coming in from the margins, from the fringes of politics right into the center, and are suddenly being asked to form governments. If you look, for instance, at the Netherlands, the always tolerant, always pragmatic Netherlands that now have elected Geert Wilders, and with him a very right-wing racist populist, and we will see what happens there. So the liberal order has not grown roots globally. Even in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the so-called alliance of the willing tried to install Western-style democracies with incredible repressive force and with incredible amounts of money, this historic project has failed. And the question is therefore very much, if after only 30 years after its triumph, this project has failed, what on earth has happened? Why has it come to that this project that seemed to have pretty much, in the eyes of its proponents, solved all of history's problems, has become a ruin and a shadow of its former self only a generation later? Of course, this project hasn't only become a ruin and a shadow of its former self, it has driven this ruin, and that is perhaps the first thing we have to say about this, because the enormous economic growth simply didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a closed system, and that makes all the difference. And that means that if you create waste, this waste remains in the system. And the enormous push that was given to the world's economies through the use of fossil fuels, and especially of oil, has directly led to the all-engulfing polycrisis that we are facing today, the crisis of natural systems, of rising sea levels, of natural disasters, of forced migration, of desertification, of problems with water that will be only rise. All these things are, in a way, side effects of the great project of economic growth that has been produced by liberal thinking, but also has given wings to liberal ideas and perhaps also made them sometimes political realities, because you need wealth to create these kind of political realities. At least I think that's a slightly provocative idea, but I do believe that. We will come back to that. But you can very well argue that a lot of the civil rights movements, of the movements that strengthened people's individual rights, rode piggyback on the oil boom. But we'll be coming back to that. Let us therefore come to the first fundamental problem that this liberal dream in its implementation will face. And that is what you might call the aporia of progress. Namely, the idea that liberal societies strive. They need growth, they generate growth, they need economic growth. And with this economic growth comes pollution, with this economic growth comes overexploitation of natural resources. And with this economic growth comes a very fundamental and very simple problem. We've all learned to calculate interest again during the COVID pandemic, because we were thinking of infection numbers. But it's a very simple calculation that an economic space that grows by 3% per year will double in 24 years and would increase tenfold within 100 years. And this growth is not possible without using more resources and creating more waste. And already the world is using more fossil fuels year on year. And that is in addition to the huge expansion of sustainable energy resources, of renewable energy resources. That is, the hunger for fossil fuels is undimmed. And the only ideas that try to bridge that are the ideas of decoupling economic growth from resource use, or ideas of degrowth or zero growth, of circular economies, etc. And I really like these ideas, but I do have a problem with them. First of all, when we speak about decoupling economic growth from resource use, this has been attempted in many countries through stimulation of other areas of the economy that are not so resource intensive, through other incentives. And in more than 30 economies that have been studied, it hasn't yet worked. It has worked to slow down the increase of resource use while speeding up the growth a bit more, but to completely decouple them has proven a fantasy so far. And it's quite easy also to see why, because of course there can be more jobs and more economic growth in service sectors, in the digital economy, and in the care sector, for instance. But if you look at the tax revenue coming from the care sector versus, for instance, the tax revenue coming from the automobile industry, you see that these are not really equivalent, and you can't really just phase the one out while building the other one up. Another problem with a degrowth economy is that democracies are expensive things. They need functioning justice systems, they need functioning institutions, they need functioning parliaments, etc., regular elections, and also the social states that we are so attached to in European countries and that we regard as such achievements of our history. They are very expensive things. And recently a third factor has come into this, and that is that defending ourselves against aggressors such as Vladimir Putin's Russia is unfortunately terribly expensive, but has simply become a necessity. And I'm sort of shocked to hear myself saying this, because I grew up in a very pacifist country. But if somebody simply refuses to play by those rules, well, you have to have some way of countering that So I don't really buy degrowth economies. And at the same time, the liberal thirst for growth, the liberal thirst for an ever elaborating economy seems to become a really vital problem, because infinite growth within a finite system is simply not possible. A second problem of the liberal project, I think I've already outlined, a second weakness, and that it's historical justification, because yes, it has liberated a lot of people, it has given a lot of people more choices in their lives, but also it has always been built on the back of a dark side that was hidden from view, certainly in the wealthy Western countries. John Locke, the great philosopher of liberalism, also wrote laws for slave plantations in America and seemingly had no problem with the existence of slaves. And so, the whole idea is historically very deeply compromised and tainted by slavery, by colonialism, by violence, by hegemony, by a very patriarchal system of power. There is, however, I think, a more urgent kind of crisis within the liberal project, and that is how its always unresolved relationship between society and market has gone. I think this is one of the most interesting parts of liberal societies, how societies and markets are made to work together or not together, how free markets are supposed to be. And here I think we see a really striking development that happened in a very short time. Liberal societies have become rich through the oil boom, through the huge increase in productivity, but also in consumer goods that oil made possible. And through that, there has been really the creation of a new kind of societies, of new values as well, of new ways of living, but also a huge increase in pollution. The world has used more fossil fuels since 1990 than in the entire human history before. And our oceans are full of microplastics. We have fertilizers in our rivers, pesticides, chemical waste. These things are not going away. They are going to stay in nature for a very long time. And so this becomes, to an extent, a story of oil, or built around oil. Oil that really bubbled up and made Western countries, and of course also the oil-producing countries, very rich. But also oil that completely changed how the relationships between these countries and within these countries worked. And with the relationship within these countries, let us look at one aspect that changed. In a coal-fueled industry, heavy industry of before the oil boom, really in the 1960s, while heavy industry was fueled by coal, well, coal takes quite a lot of human labor, certainly then took a lot of human labor to get out of the ground. And it's also quite cumbersome and heavy to transport. So it was logical and indeed necessary to put the great industrial plants close to the mines. And you see that in the Ruhr area in Germany, you see that in Belgium, in northern France, you see that in Poland, and these are only the European area, you see it in the United States as well. And that, of course, gave the workers a certain amount of bargaining power. With the advent of oil, that all changed. Oil came from countries where human rights protections weren't very strong. Oil could also be extracted with a fraction of the labor that coal took. And oil could be easily transported all over the place in tankers or by pipelines. And all of a sudden the production of the energy and the production of the industrial goods could be in quite different places and could be relocated at will as fast as an investment worked and as fast as it took to build a new factory somewhere. And that profoundly changed the political landscape, certainly in Europe and the US, because, well, it simply robbed working people of their bargaining power in this process and made them fall back in a kind of precarious working position where there was no collective representation, no collective bargaining, and therefore a much more uncertain working life. And that is pretty much the world in which many Europeans, many people in Western countries find themselves now. But this is not the only thing that happened. It wasn't just that deindustrialization stripped working people of their political bargaining power in Western countries. There was also something else happening that had to do with this great transformation, with this great revolution, especially with the revolution of the students in 1968. This is a really interesting episode, and yes, it all has to do with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and free love, and Woodstock, etc. But it was really also a generational moment of young people protesting against the values and the lives of their elders and wanting to create a completely new, completely different world. The political scientist Pippa Norris has looked at this and has written about this phenomenon, and I think she makes a very strong point by looking at a generational analysis and saying before this was the generation of the builders after the war, and after wars people normally are more conservative and they want certainty. They have seen the worst and they want to build something up. Now their next generation, especially as the building up with the help of oil had gone beyond everybody's wildest expectation, the next generation was ready to rebel, and was also ready to rebel from a historically very easy position, and completely new position, because first of all these young people had jobs to go to as soon as they wanted to. And secondly, with the pill, a different sexual morality simply became possible. An unwanted pregnancy was no longer so horrible, and hence also the fight for access to abortion. So all of a sudden, a new generation found completely new possibilities and had reason to rebel. Think of the war in Vietnam. Think in Europe of how the Second World War had been treated and had been used as an occasion for national myth-making and for often the continuation of old structures of power. So boom, here came the revolution. And a huge cohort of young people bust into the universities. Many of these universities had just been built. And this cohort of the baby boomers was a very large young generation, and they rebelled against their elders. And then they carried these rebellious energies into the places that university-educated people go to, into newspapers and other media, into government, into the arts, into the theaters, etc. And so you had, after 1968, a cohort of a generational group of baby boomers who carried these very liberal, very new views into the landscape of culture and the media and of politics, and to institutionalize these values very strongly. But, as Pippa Norris pointed out, they didn't often take with them the rest of the population, the moral ideas of the rest of the population, the universe a lot of other people lived in, other people who were perhaps happier to identify with patriotism, with their religion, with traditional gender roles. And that had always been okay. That had always been a stable kind of system of values, but all of a sudden it was said to be old-fashioned or worse, reactionary and actually evil. So the 1968 revolution did create real change, but it also created a kind of festering social division between the opinion leaders in society and between many people who didn't want to follow them that far. I think that's a very interesting observation that Pippa Norris has made there, one that we'll come back to because it also says a lot about the discourse today that goes against the elites and against the media, the system media, against the sciences, etc. But let's look for more reasons why this liberal project seems suddenly so precarious. And here comes another reason that I find really crucial. We have learned from Thomas Piketty, the French economist, that in most developed economies, work is taxed much higher than profit from capital. And that means it's a simple question of math, that capital grows, that earnings from capital grow much more strongly than earnings from growth. And that means that eventually you get a class of people who possess something that they have to inherit, that they have to give as an inheritance to another generation. And you have a new generation of people who already inherit assets. And because their value grows more quickly than the value that people can create by simply working, you effectively get a class of people who are born with different preconditions than other people. You effectively get a new kind of aristocracy that has different possibilities in life, more chances in life. And within the last generation, or perhaps two generations, that has been amplified vastly by the liberalization of financial markets, by a different kind of doing business. It has created super wealth. And just let's remember, this is really a new phenomenon, this kind of super wealth. Yes, there were enormously rich people in other centuries, people who had vast wealth, who were richer than other entire countries. But there were very few, they were usually in very few particular businesses, and also their fortunes waned and waxed. But it's different from what's happened in the last two generations. And around 1960, a senior company executive, earned about 40 times of what his, or 30 times to 40 times what his employees earned as an average. Today, CEOs of big corporations earn about 400 times what their average employees earn. And this kind of enormous gap opening up is in fact quite characteristic. During the COVID pandemic, the 10 richest men in the world became twice as rich again. And that means that today these 10 individuals control as many resources as the 3 billion poorest people in the world. We could go on, but other podcasts, other videos do that at length and give you this analysis. The fact is, this has really changed disproportionately, and it has also changed really, really fast. And in effect, we now have in most Western democracies a small band of de facto aristocrats who live by different rules, who don't pay as many taxes as other people proportionally, who have their money in tax paradises or in trusts or in foundations, who have disproportionately great influence on political decision-making because they can give party donations, and in countries where that's more difficult, they can influence through trusts and think tanks and through different kinds of constructions. They can lobby very effectively. Very often laws are drawn up by lawyers of private individuals and then simply given to members of parliament to put into parliament and to put through. That doesn't always work, but these things happen quite often. And my worry about this is not that people are rich. I have no problem with people being rich. I think a bit of inequality in society is a good thing. Stephen Reich, by the way, agrees with me about that. If you work hard, great for you if you get rich. But this kind of super wealth, in fact, sort of leads democracy completely ad absurdum. Democracy is built on the system of one person, one vote. And if some individuals have so much more influence on democratic decision-making, then really democracy becomes impossible. I think we see that in states like the United States, how distorted democracy can come when big money enters into it. So I think, this kind of super wealth, this kind of creation of a new aristocracy in democratic societies is a big problem. It is also a big problem in perception, because in the financial crisis 2008, many people learned that states are willing to save banks but not private individuals, that profits are privatized and losses are socialized, that not one banker went to prison after the 2008 crisis. Actually, that's not true. One banker did, but he was in Iceland. And that otherwise they were paying themselves record bonuses 2 years later again. And so it's quite understandable that people would have a certain loss of trust in this kind of system that is obviously not there for them, but is there for other people. You can also visualize that through another number, and I promise that I stop talking numbers, but I can't quite promise that, but I will try. The other thing is the great decoupling, not of productivity and resources, but of productivity and wages. And you can quite clearly see that from 1945 to about 1980, industrial productivity rose by 100%, which is enormous, and wages pretty much rose with them. And then comes a strategic point at which wages start stagnating, but productivity rises and rises ever further. So that today we have realized, or Western industries have realized, another 150% rise in productivity, but wages have in effect stagnated since 1980 or since the 1980s. And the entire difference, the entire new wealth created there, in this gap between the stagnating wages and the rising productivity, that goes into the financial markets and into private fortunes. And that fuels its own economy that unfortunately has effects back on the economies in which we all live. The 1980s, of course, are not... It's not an accident that you get this development then. This is the time of Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain and of Ronald Reagan in the United States, the great deregulation, the beginning of a neoliberal world. Margaret Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society, there are only individuals. And the deregulation of financial markets, the globalization of economies. This is the time when this enormous shift then takes place. And this is a shift that leaves a lot of people behind also economically. And so now you get all of a sudden, actually not all of a sudden, but it's only the success that is so sudden, we get a wave of populisms from India to the United States and from Hungary to the Netherlands. And all these populists say that they're talking for the normal people, for the little people, for the people who are left behind, for the decent people, and they're against the establishment, against the elites, against the system media, against the deep state. And whether you look at Brexit or at Narendra Modi or at Javier Milei, you always find people who, in interviews, voters who say, we don't care, we just want change. And I think if you look at what I just described, if you look at the dislocation, the disorientation that was caused by a social revolution that wasn't fully achieved throughout society, by an economic revolution that very quickly began to favor the rich over the working, then you see that perhaps the feeling of being patronized, being left behind, is not entirely unjustified. And I think it is even exacerbated by another factor, with which I want to close this little rant that I'm giving today about the liberal project. But one factor that is often overlooked, but that is, I think, hugely important, that is simply acceleration. Historical acceleration, the acceleration of developing technologies. Things are simply going faster. If you look at how people lived 100 years ago, when the modern world just invaded and entered most people's homes, and if you compare that to what happened every generation afterwards, and you see the huge changes that speed up ever more until you get today's digital world, until you get social media, until you get now artificial intelligence. But also the exploding productivity, the completely different consumer worlds, the completely different social worlds people live in, the different moral ideas that are there, the different scientific discoveries and technological possibilities that are there. We live in a world that is accelerating so massively that what was true 30 years ago is no longer really true. And what the cognitive skills people developed when they were young are no longer very useful, and the terms in which they see the world, for instance, with regard to the climate crisis, well, they were different 2 generations ago than they are now. They were radically different. And all of that enormous acceleration, I think, creates a kind of sense of dislocation, of disorientation, and also of resentment. And I think that is also understandable. So we are having many elements of change here that go very rapidly, that create many victims, that also create many positive effects. But mostly they go enormously fast, and they have very destructive effects that you can't understand with the ideas of yesterday. That is, shall we say, the status quo at the end of this first little rant about liberalism. The next rant is sure to follow. In fact, I'm going to record it very quickly. But I would love to hear from you. I would love to hear your comments. I would love to hear whether you think my ideas, my explorations are interesting, are valuable, or whether they completely miss the point. And before you really get exercised about me not seeing anything in particular, be sure to listen to the next episode as well. I will go on there with this little survey. But like this podcast, subscribe to this podcast, leave me comments. All of that helps to develop this podcast, and I would love to do that. I would love to hear from you and also get your suggestions, your observations. Perhaps that will also result in new episodes. So for today, Philip Blom says thank you for listening and stay curious, and see you again soon with the Blomcast.